When viewing Webster Cottage at 32 North Main Street, the outside plaque states that Daniel Webster, the famous American statesman, and Henry Fowle Durant, born Henry Wells Smith, the founder of Wellesley College, once lived there. The females who live there are not even mentioned. Yet they're the ones that saved that cottage so it's in this town for us to see. Here is my attempt to remember some of their history. The Wheelock family moved to Hanover from Columbia, Connecticut in 1770. Wait, it's not moving.
Oh, no, hold on.
Hold on, sorry.
No.
Is it stuck? There it is. What did I have to do?
I just pressed this. Do you know?
Yeah, this
Oh, do up and down.
down, okay. Good, perfect. All right, she helped me, thanks. The Wheelock family moved and Abigail was 19 years old. They were moving to be with her father, Eleazar Wheelock, who was beginning a new educational project, a college that some of you have heard of. She came by carriage with her mother. Others rode horses or walked. She was one of 8 children. Two Native American students moved with them, as well as several slaves. Her father owns 19 slaves over his lifetime and willed them to his son. Abigail is not mentioned as having slaves. The Wheelocks lived in one-story temporary house until the Wheelock mansion was erected in 1773. And when I did research, eventually that mansion goes to Emily Howe, and eventually Emily's house becomes this. It's interesting.
But Cindy, wasn't that the original Howe Library, the
Yeah.
Wheelock home? Right.
Yeah. Abigail Wheelock is important because her house is the location of the Hanover Historical Society. But of course, look at, they came to this wilderness. And the house is one of the oldest in town. The founder of Dartmouth College gave his daughter Abigail as a dower 15 acres when she married Savannah Ripley in 1774. This was a way to give property to a female daughter, which was difficult. She and her husband built the cottage. Her husband had graduated from the first class of Dartmouth, and there's a picture of the cottage if you don't remember it. And maybe some of you don't know how many were in the first class of Dartmouth. 4. Oh my gosh. He studied divinity, was a tutor at the college, a missionary, a trustee, and a professor. I think we can call her a professor's wife. When her father died in 1779, his will gave her 100 more acres, including land down to the Connecticut River. And I put this on because I had to imagine what she looked like. This is, then I got some statement from Alice Van Leer Carrick, another person who lived in the cottage who we will study today. She wrote in 1929 her view of Abigail Ripley, the first woman at the cottage. Now remember, she has quite a sense of humor. Did Mrs. Ripley ever long for the white satins, the changeable lute strings, the silk and cashmere shawls, the modes and sarconets advertised by the enterprising trader Oliver Hatch across the river in Norwich? Or did she console herself with a receipt for a lady's dress published in the late 18th century number of the Dartmouth Gazette? Permit me to quote it because it's engagingly naive for you to miss. And this is what she's quoting. Let simplicity be your white, charity your vermilion, dress your eyebrows with modesty, your lips with reservedness. Let instruction be your earrings, and good humor the front pin on your head. Submission to your husband is your best ornament. Employ your hands in housewifery and keep your feet within your own doors. Let your garments be made of the silk of probity, the fine linen of sanctity, and the purple of charity. And then Alice, of course, has to make a smirky remark. If you ask me, a thin consolation. So that's a modern woman looking back at a woman who was constricted by her life in that time period. Abigail had 6 children, so I'm going to focus on her girls. Of course, most of their history is absorbed by who they married and their male children. They were the helpmates of their husbands and children. Not much is recorded about them separate from their family history. As children, they probably went to the school which was part of the Dartmouth, and they probably had faculty teachers. The first schoolhouse was built in 1807 on School Street, where the Christian Science building now stands. So I'm assuming that they went to a one-room schoolhouse, grew up, and met Dartmouth men at the different gatherings. Females would not have had a college education. So we must abstract from their husbands' lives. And you can see that Sylvanus, we lost Sylvanus because he had an accident and he did not live. So she was left with her 6 children. Abigail and her children were left alone, and she had to figure out what to do about Webster Cottage. She stayed in Choate House, which was next door, until 1794. Her son-in-laws eventually bought the cottage to help her. And they were the ones that helped her have Daniel Webster, who we've heard about, as a boarder in 1800. She eventually moves to Freiburg, Maine. But we're going to focus on the girls. And the first one I want to talk about is Mary Ripley. She was the second child and the first female, born in 1778 before they went to Webster Cottage. She grew up in Hanover and met a Dartmouth graduate of 1794, Nicholas Bayliss. They married in 1798, moved to Woodstock, where he studied law and practiced law. They lived in the house, which is now the Woodstock History Center, and I thought that was quite interesting. So that house has been saved. And they were there from 1800 to 1809. Then they moved to Montpelier, Vermont. He was a state's attorney, eventually Associate Justice of the Vermont Supreme Court. They had 3 children, and then she died in 1830. So that's her history. Next one, Abigail Ripley, named for her mother, was the 3rd child, and according to Hanover historian Francis Lane Childs, was born in 1780 in the cottage. So here we have one that was born in the cottage. She grew up in Hanover as well. In 1804, she married Dr. Lyman, who had studied at the Dartmouth Medical School. So I wanted to show you a picture of the early Dartmouth Medical School. They had 7 children. In 1815, they moved to Lancaster, New Hampshire, and he had an extensive practice in medicine and surgery. After many years, he gave up his profession, opened an office as Justice of the Peace. He was active in Masonry and did much to promote it. His wife, Abigail, died in 1827. So we've done 2 of the girls. The 5th child of the Ripleys was Elizabeth, born in 1784. She grew up in Hanover and married Judah Dana, another Dartmouth man, class of 1795. She was married in 1800 when she was 15 years old. This is important women's history for us. In New England, by 1800, there were more women than men. Yet the goal for a girl was marriage. The only role that counted was that of wife and mother. Women were not considered equal to men, and a woman could not prepare for a career or a life of independence as a man could. Women married young, you've heard this, 15, and started their large families. Elizabeth had 8 children. She had a short life and died at age 35. Her husband remarried and lived till 73. Judah even bought the cottage and kept it for a few years. We do have a drawing of her husband. He did teach at Moore's Indian Charity School and studied law in Hanover, but they did move to Freiburg, Maine, and he had a short term as a senator from that state. At one point, Daniel Webster, who did know Elizabeth Ripley Dana and her husband Judah, found out from Judah that he would be a good headmaster for Freiburg Academy in Maine. So he did go over there, and he stayed at the Freiburg for a while and then went to Boston and his Boston career. So Daniel Webster was over there. The cottage was rented out from 1802 to 1816. I don't have information on that. But we have a new chapter. 1816, William Smith bought it. He trained as a lawyer in Orford. He soon married Harriet Fowle of Watertown, Mass. in 1817. She was one of 5 girls in the family and was from an aristocratic family near Boston. So I gave you a picture of where she came from. Her husband was a lawyer in Hanover, and they had 4 children. The first was a girl, but she died at 13 months. Then came 2 boys, and the 4th was Adeline, but she died at age 11. And here, I thought that was kind of cute to show you a lawyer coming into town. But the loss of little children was a plague to families at this time period, before modern medicine. Infectious diseases were rampant, and as many as 5 children, 1 in 5 died by 5 years of age from pneumonia, diarrhea, or another common childhood infection. So we don't have any girls to study in the Smith family. William Smith's sister came from Salisbury, New Hampshire to Hanover and did teach in town. And our historian, Frances Lane Child, states that she might have even lived at Webster Cottage for a while. Harriet Fowle Smith must have managed the house before they went to Dracut, Massachusetts. Her famous son changed his name to Henry Fowle Durant. And he started Wellesley College for women. So the family had moved from Webster Cottage when he was 11 years old, but we have his name on our great plaque out front because he did live there a while and he did start Wellesley College. And I could give you a long talk on how important Wellesley College is because it obviously was a great breakthrough for women. Okay, in 1836, the cottage was sold to Miss Mary Tolford McMurphy of Derry, New Hampshire, and she ran a boarding house. So we do move into the boarding house years. She was there her whole life and she got to age 95, so that was a good life. Her niece came also to live with her. And this is her niece in this picture. Students would board with them, and then they'd attend fraternities for social life, since fraternities were started in 1842. Lucy Jane McMurphy is described this way. She attended public schools in Derry, New Hampshire. She went to the Adams Female Academy. She studied in Hanover and at the Academy in Peacham, Vermont. She was a teacher and had lived in many states until she returned to Hanover again and taught many children from the faculty. She also brought them in and taught at Webster Cottage, which is interesting. We have a teacher at Webster Cottage. In her older years, she was confined to her house by rheumatism, but she kept up with conversations. And when she died, Dartmouth College bought the cottage in 1901. She is also described by Alice Van Leer Carrick in a short article. Here is her take on Miss McMurphy. Now remember, Alice has quite a sense of humor again. Miss McMurphy, who alas died the year before we came to Hanover, her fame will endure as long as she lives. To the alumni who knew her, old grads returned for their reunions, men who are very little interested apparently in Webster, meaning they don't care about Daniel Webster, and not at all interested in us or our collection. Not what she means is they didn't care about Webster Cottage and all her beautiful antiques. They came back to see the dining room where they were boarders deluxe at $4 a week, then a princely sum. And to taste again in the memory of the bountiful food, which they all insist was the most delicious ever served in Hanover. A formal lady she must have been. The old window niche at the end of the long room still remains to show where she sat in state to serve the soup and the coffee and to receive the low reverences that students and faculty alike made as they entered and left the room. I know I should have adored her. This is Alice talking about it. She was the patron saint of all stray pussycats in town, and highly amiable, I'm sure. One of the women of the town tells me that from the time she was a child, the elder Miss McMurphy bestowed little pats and plum cakes equally upon her. The house was a constant stream of kindness. So it sounds like the boarding house days were kind of lovely for the students. Now remember, you don't have dorms in this time period. So you have a boarding house, and this one was very, very popular. But dorms are starting to be built, so boarding houses are becoming out of favor. The college made repairs and torn down buildings around this cottage after these days, and they decided to rent it out to Professor and Mrs. Skinner. And we go now to them, the Skinners. Who was Alice Van Leer Carrick, who married Ord Skinner and moved to the small town of Hanover, New Hampshire? Well, what do you think? Pretty wild, right? She was born in 1875 in Nashville, Tennessee. Her mother was from the South, but her father was from the North. Her father moved his family of five to Somerville, Massachusetts in 1880, and he was in shoe manufacturing. So Alice's mother's Southern roots were mainly learned from her relatives who told her about plantations lost to raiding armies. Alice attended schools in Somerville and started writing stories for children when she was 18 years old. She met her future husband as part of the larger Harvard-Boston social group. He had grown up in Dorchester, Massachusetts, gone to Boston Latin School, and didn't attend Harvard until about 10 years later. After completing a master's degree in Romance languages, he taught at Harvard, traveled to Europe on a fellowship, and then went to Dartmouth to teach Romance languages in 1900. Alice had thrived in Boston without a college degree and saw some women even being offered serious professional employment. That was not to be true in Hanover. Marianne Harris, one of our Historical Society members who I knew quite well, she's no longer with us, but she wrote and did quite a lot of research on Carrick. Harris described Alice and provided photos. She wrote, Alice was tall and large-boned with aquiline features, and her long dark hair was usually arranged in a bun. She dressed in wool skirts, wearing canvas espadrilles on her feet with a turban around her head. People who knew Alice considered her voice to be shrill, and she was theatrical, not like other Hanover women. So here we have Alice. And this is what Harris wrote, some of it from this era. They came to Hanover when there was a time of transition from Victorian horse and buggy days, outdoor plumbing and lamplight, to the coming of the first motor cars and electricity. The town was dominated by males at the college and males running the town. Women might enjoy a sleigh ride or go ice skating. They were to stay in the domestic sphere, running the household, providing a comforting environment for their professor husbands, overseeing the upbringing of children, and arranging entertainment for themselves and the community. A small group of women augmented their husbands' starvation salaries. Now, are you hearing that? Dartmouth professors had starvation salaries with acceptable paid work. So the women could be music teachers, student tutors, secretaries in college offices, or clerks in the Main Street stores. Alice was different. She even opened her house to the public for tours on Thursdays. So in other words, Webster Cottage at that point was a place where you could go for a tour on Thursdays. She lived there until about 1960 and was the last tenant of the house. They did take in some roomers, but had their 3 children there. And someone asked me, did they have any help? Yes, she had maids from time to time, but nobody really lived up to her standards. But she did have a few. Alice added to the income of her husband by publishing books and giving talks. She did so well that she had a national fame as an authority on antiques. She added antiques to the cottage and shared her life there with faculty and friends. It was the party house of her time. Tuesday was tea time, and often Dartmouth students stopped by for this open hospitality they didn't see in other homes. In other words, she opened up the home to the kids, and they came by. Sunday night suppers could last until midnight, so she'd have people come in then. The Skinners were also part of an arts club began in 1914 where poets came to read in Robinson Hall. You might meet Robert Frost or Edna St. Vincent Millay if you attended them. She spoke out on issues of the day. Friends say she complained about the chauvinistic men in town. She was way ahead of her time. She criticized Dartmouth for the lack of opportunity for women. Remember the talk we had about Dr. Hannah Crossdale, the PhD who came to Dartmouth in 1935, but was not a full professor until 1968, after having taught scores of students. 21 of Alice's books are still available on Amazon. Oh, I did want to put this in. This is one equality of women and men. We could skate together, right? And that's probably a compond, don't you
I
think?
think so.
One of those. 20 of her books are available on Amazon. The book Collector's Luck is available on the internet. So you can read it now without paying anybody anything. Besides the one on Webster Cottage, the Next to Nothing House, written in 1922, she wrote of collecting in America, Spain, France, and England. She had a philosophy that women should work with beautiful objects to make their housework more enjoyable. She wanted economic independence for women, and with her publishing empire, she did quite well. Here's some material from Antiques magazine, and this is about Alice. Through storm and sunshine, along dusty roads and up unspeakably muddy lanes, from sunrise until there is hardly a light left twinkling in the lonely farmhouses, we have followed and found our treasures, says Kara, wrote of Seeking Antiques. Such excursions were not the only way to find antiques, however. Even a small town like Hanover, Carrick said, there are frequently sales, removals, people willing to part with some heirloom. There were also sales of student furnishings, some of which were antique, and country auctions. A country auction is a neighborhood entertainment. Everyone goes, she wrote. And in cities, particularly on the East Coast, there were small, inexpensive old furniture shops and places where secondhand goods are sold, and little auction rooms, even big auction rooms on a rainy day or at an off season, in which she found her bargains. Besides these sources, Carrick advised developing a relationship with the local junkman, for he travels all over and he can bring something back to you. Alice felt she was part of an effort to preserve the heritage of New England, and that what she collected was not valued enough by the owners. Are you getting that point? She felt she was collecting and she would bring it value and improve it by showing it off in Webster Cottage. And often when she went to these farmhouses, the people had like a beautiful quilt just sort of thrown down for the hens to run on. So she felt she was saving artifacts for history. She wrote many magazine articles too. She wrote as if she was talking to the reader. Here's an example of one of her writings. Here's an article, and this little tea caddy here is what she's writing about. A tea caddy is a container for your tea. But of the pieces I'm showing here, with one exception, generally old, most of them a full century perhaps, the others right side of 1840. Of them all, I love my tea caddy best. You see how she loves her antiques. I think it is so demure and engaging. It has such a delightful design of gold and silver fruit, such a well-modeled lion's head handle. Once at an auction, I almost got a tea kettle to go to. Missing that is one of the minor tragedies of my life. For I didn't wait. If I had just left more money, if I'd only said 10, because I've spent the other 5 long since and I've nothing to show for it, I'm quite of a view of my friend who says, oh my dear, it isn't the things that I get I regret, it's the things that I didn't. So in other words, you can see her philosophy, how she bid and got these antiques. Her book, Collector's Luck in France, describes her travels in that country. So she really did travel. She even met Auguste Rodin and Claude Monet and acquired rare and valuable art pieces. So she did go to Spain, England, all from this little Webster Cottage now, all making money on her books and her articles. And of course, her husband's starvation salary. Her book, A History of American Silhouettes, a Collector's Guide, 1790 through 1840, was even republished in 1968. The word silhouette came from a minister of finance in France, but Alice preferred profile as a better description. What are silhouettes? Before photography came to America in 1839, artists would go to towns and offer these depictions to families. It was purported that a person's living character could be read from the facial outline in a silhouette. Artists even created machines to do this. Alice's collection of silhouettes were donated to the Smithsonian. So she really collected at a very high level these silhouettes. Now, some of you are familiar with them. If you go to Webster Cottage, we do have some silhouettes. I don't think they're Alice's. One of my next projects is to see what is left at Webster Cottage from Alice's collecting, if anything. I'd like to look through. I know some of the fireplaces are still there that she designed. Okay, her children. 2 were female. The children lived in a museum, Webster Cottage, with its curator. You heard that? The children grew up in a museum with a curator. But the daughters were still proud of their mother. One is quoted as saying, "It impressed me that she went out collecting and lecturing and did all that writing. She felt that women should have more of a place in the world. Everything she preached, I believed then and I do now. I was glad she was that way. I always felt she should have a life of her own as well as my father and not live in his shadow. Because he had, if you study him, which we're not doing tonight, he had quite an impact. There's many people writing about him and how, what a good professor he was. And there was a retrospective on him. You can get this on the internet. You can zoom in and read about him if you want. Daughter Margaret Van Leer Skinner was born in 1902. She's the one I just showed you. She was often called in to help with her siblings so her mother could write. Margaret went on to Wellesley College. She married Joseph Hancourt, a Dartmouth graduate again. In 1930, they lived in Wellesley, Mass, and he was an investment advisor. I could not find any record of any children. Her sister, Alicia, now that's an interesting term from Alice to Alicia. Alicia Prescott Skinner was born in 1909 and went to Smith College. She married John Porter Carleton from the class of Dartmouth 22, who grew up in Hanover and was a lawyer in Manchester, New Hampshire. Now he's the real famous one. He was quite the skier. He even competed in the Olympics. He's on the far side there.
Wow.
In the early Olympics, he also competed in 1932 with the first Eastern
John
Ski
and
Association.
we get to the front and she was so like welcoming and just funny and like
What's that?
What's going on, Sue?
Oh, all right. Okay, never mind. He also was competing in the Eastern Amateur Ski Association downhill race on Mount Musalak. I also read that he was the first one to go down Tuckerman's Ravine.
Oh.
He really was. He was this really outstanding person on skis. As chairman of the New Hampshire Ski Trails Committee of the State Development Commission in 1933, he oversaw the planning of 40 miles of new ski trails cut by the Civilian Conservation Corps. Remember, that was done in New Hampshire and Vermont. It went from New Hampshire to Vermont to Maine. So he actually, I have a picture of him jumping. Wow. He was famous for that. And he also, as I said, designed that whole trail. And here's a picture of him as an older man. So he really did, he was a Hanover guy too. So we need to take into his history, I think. If we want to look for grandchildren, we need to turn to Alice's son, because Alicia and John had 2 children, but they had died at very young ages. So John Carrick Skinner moved to New York City, married a New Yorker, and did have a child. So there's a possibility there's still a granddaughter somewhere. And to wrap up a little bit here, in her study of Alice Van Leer Carrick Skinner, Marianne Harris wrote quite a bit about how Alice was a champion for women in their work. Harris wrote, "It was by studying the artifacts created by women in the ordinariness of their days that Alice became an advocate for including women's stories in the study of history. Her desire to recover women's culture and women's history was unheard of in 1920. And Marianne's quite correct on this. You don't have women's studies coming into colleges until the 1960s, 70s. So Alice was extremely early. Her own love of adventure, her enthusiasm and vigor gave her the will to live an independent life in a community dominated by men. She remains an inspiration to all women who would dare to define themselves to fulfill their potential as individuals. Alice is the perfect subject for March Women's History Month, in my opinion. Now, you've heard the story of women who actually lived in the cottage, grew up in the cottage, spent time in the cottage. But many women and men have kept this cottage going as a historical society, and we owe much to them. And that's probably another whole story about who did what to keep the little building going. If the cottage interests you, we have docent positions. And we would love to talk to you about volunteering this summer. We are open from June to mid-October, and we're open Wednesdays and Saturdays from 2:30 to 4:30. So please come join us to continue this wonderful story. And those are my remarks. So questions, comments? Oh, Susan, yes.
One of the slides you showed of the boarding house days had the
Yes.
two women at the top, and they looked like there were 10 people. Where did they all go? How did you fit those people?
Where they
in that?
slept, right, where did they sleep?
Where did they sleep?
Well, remember, do you remember the slide with the larger Webster Cottage?
But it wasn't that.
No, but there was a whole addition that's been pulled off in our day. Did you realize that? And if you open one of the doors,
Yeah.
you can see
Kitchen.
where there was a modern bathroom and there was a whole addition. So there was more space.
More space.
And Alice even had more space when she ran Webster Cottage. It was the Hanover Historical Society, and I guess the town might have helped, that took that addition away and made it as small as it is today. So there was more room. And you would double up. You'd have 2 to a bedroom, right?
2 to a little tiny bit.
Yeah, right?
And you were talking about the Sunday dinners she would do.
Yes.
I'm like, where did they put all those people?
Well, I don't know how big those dinners were. It was more, they were fun. It seemed like she had an awful lot of fun in her life. And even though she complained so much about males dominating the town, she seemed to find her space, didn't she? And how she could work with the males and get along with the males. So she was able to, I think, do very well. I don't think she was unpopular. I think she was popular. Look at the students dropping in and having tea with her. Look at people knocking on the door on Thursdays for their tours. And then look at the Sunday night dinners. Of course, as she became so popular, she did go and tour. I mentioned all these countries, France, England, Spain. So she might have been away more from the cottage than we're thinking, and not having as many parties and so on. But she was a social life outside of the fraternities. The fraternities were the other social life, it seems. All right, other questions, comments? So I think she's our big star. And if I had to redo the plaque out front, I would definitely put her on there because she really, even today, I told you, she has book after book on Amazon. She has one that you can read. And she has this conversational style about her collecting that's quite charming, I think, if you like that. And I brought a couple of books for you to see back there if you want to look at them. And then I think she's hard on poor Abigail Ripley, the first resident, but Abigail really was a girl of her time and had been brought up to Hanover from fairly civilized Columbia, Connecticut, and into the wilds of Hanover and had to really deal with what happened to her with her husband dying and all these children she had to take care of. So I think I'd be much kinder on Abigail than Alice Van Leer Kerrick was. I would be kinder on her. And then it seemed like Alice thought the boarding house days were fabulous. The boys had great food, great fun, and lived it up. All right, other comments, questions? Yeah, Alan.
I'm curious with all the buying of antiques, on her husband's salary, did she have money family money herself?
No, she made the money in those days. I know it's hard to believe because in today's world, sometimes you don't do too well with your books. But with her books and her articles, she was paid well. And then she also did lectures. She was paid for her lectures too. So no, she had money and had enough money to travel to France, to travel to Spain, to travel to England. It wasn't on his money, it was her money. So she did very, very well. And that's what she was so proud of. That's why Women's History Month for her. I mean, we should talk about it. She was able to pull themselves up economically and do quite well and was proud of that whole history. But yet she shared the antiques with the town. And every week that she was in residence, she had people come in. That if you do read more about her, I mean, she did have kind of messy desk areas where she did all her research. She had book after book. She was so self-taught. She never went to a college, and she had to learn about all these antiques. And also people called on her all the time. People in the town called on her and said, can you please verify this antique? Is it really this? Is it really that? And she would do that. So and I think she might have charged for some of those services out when she went and did that. And also, if you got the gist of her antiquing, she bought something for very little and then might have sold it for quite a bit. She was very good at analyzing and seeing, a diamond in the rough. So, and I didn't even get into the part of her selling antiques, but she must have sold some. She didn't just keep them. She probably had them coming and going quite a bit. So there's all the money.
Yeah, her making money from her writings and all, there's a room in the Webster Cottage where it talks about, I think it mentions one of a woman named Kate Sanborn,
Yes.
who lived, I think she was active in the late 1800s. early
She was a very early writer
And
too.
she lived by her writing and speaking, which was very unusual.
She was able to do
But
that
she-
too.
Kate Sanborn was I think her relationship was through Daniel Webster's brother. She was a descendant.
You're correct. She didn't grow up in Webster Cottage, so she
Yeah.
didn't make this talk.
No.
But she definitely was very knowledgeable, self-educated again, didn't go to college, ended up teaching at Smith. Kate Sanborn was smart enough and educated herself enough so she could even teach college kids. Yeah, so she was very, very accomplished. That's another one, and you're right, Alan, she made money with her lectures and with her books too. And I didn't even mention all the Alice Van Leer Carrick books. She wrote children's books too, tons of them. So she was just constantly putting out books and doing well. Well, anyhow, thank you for coming. Feel free to talk to each other and come again May 16th when we have Dina coming and speaking. So thank you.
Thank you.
Question on Zoom here.
Oh, goodbye Zoomers. No, I don't know. Do they have questions? Well,
I noticed somebody had put some questions, that Mary Conan letter had some questions on there.
There were no questions, but there was one comment. So many women who have kept historical sites in their stories for subsequent generations to visit.
Yes. Good. Nice summation.
I thought I saw a question in that Mary was asking about whether any information on these women is in Rauner.
Oh, yeah.
Do we know that?
Yes, yes, there's got to be a big section on Alice and Rauner. But as you heard from what I said, you don't learn much about women. You mainly hear about their husbands.
Yeah.
There's plenty of material on their husbands, for sure, but not hardly anything on them. And that's why I tried to explain to you why there wasn't material on them, because they were to be the helpmates, the mothers, to take care of children. They were to do all of that. And that picture of the woman tending the fire and the child, and we do have a fireplace at Webster Cottage. And you'd be pretty busy making your candles, making your food, and taking care of your 8 kids. I keep bringing that up. I told you every time how many kids they had. And the one woman died at 35, and yet she still had 8 kids. So, you don't have much time for other things if you're taking care of kids and doing all this housework, which had to be done. And we have a good representation of that in Webster Cottage, don't you feel? With the spinning wheels, with the candle making, with the open fireplace. We have a very good presentation of what it was like to do all that women's work. Yeah.
Yes.
That's it. Oh, that's it. Unless people have questions, comments.
I just wanted to say that
Yes.
she certainly would have really relished time with Kate Sanborn,
Yeah.
who, by the way, didn't marry, and I think her father supported. She taught over her woodshed to local girls, and anyway, it's really fun to read, and it was so fun to hear this because they're so similar. So I imagine that Alice and Kate, were part of this community that was probably quite stronger than maybe we realized that women were getting together and rising up and supporting themselves on their own, which I wouldn't have expected in the hinterlands with all this men from Dartmouth. So,
You're right.
yeah.
I think Alice, though, in her writing says that most of the women were basically happy with this role of supporting their husband, being lovely in the home. And then I mentioned the clubs that developed. Remember? Yeah, so they did find ways to entertain everybody and enjoy their life here. I don't want to present it that they didn't enjoy their life. They did.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And the college attracted a lot of folks from the outside who were lecturing too, so there was quite a bit of culture coming in.
Yes, and the women could go to all of that because I mentioned that Alice met in the St. Vincent Millay. She talked to Robert Frost. So yes, they were able to meet quite high-level people through the Dartmouth connections. And she enjoyed that, obviously. And she probably had them at Little Webster Cottage. Can you believe it? I mean, I can't emphasize enough. It's the tiniest place to have a superstar like this in there with her antiques and talking about them and opening the door and having people come in. And that's kind of what we're trying to continue on doing by running the cottage, welcoming people, and showing them the antiques that we do have there. We're kind of carrying on Alice Van Leer Skinner's tradition by doing this. Now, we haven't been collecting antiques like she did, though. We've been given things over time. I don't know if all of you have been to Webster Cottage. Have you been, Tim? Oh, yeah, okay. So you can see some of the things we have there are quite special. But she tried to bring up the level all the time on better and better antiques, which was interesting.
Which also bodes to her selling. It's as she's improving her collection, she would continually sell it.
I think so.
Because you would never know what you're gonna find, and then once you did, you're like, something's gotta go, especially in that size of a cottage.
Yeah.
Sure.
I think you're right. I think she was constantly switching out. That's what I want to do. I want to take next to nothing house. I have a copy here you can look at and look at the pictures. There's quite a few pictures in there, you'll see, and match those with what we have and see if anything matches, or did she really move everything along? And these silhouettes went to the Smithsonian, so we don't have those. We have copies of silhouettes, but we don't have the fancy silhouettes, the lovely, lovely ones.
Except the Smithsonian's just got them all in storage at this point. Maybe they should send a day of light back here in Hanover where they came from.
Oh, all right, that's an idea. Did you hear that idea? We should have the silhouettes brought to Hanover from her collection. All right, I don't know if they let them out, but we could try.
Well, they might let them back. You never know. I mean, it just, so many of these places have so much material and they just don't know what to do with it. So you never know. Can never hurt to ask.
That's right. It's a good point. And I think most of you do realize that about half of what we have at Webster Cottage is owned by the Hood Museum. So we have some very, very fine pieces that yeah, did you realize that? About half are owned by the Hood and half are town, I call it Hanover Historical Society items that were donated over time to the Historical Society. So about half are quote unquote ours and half are the Hood. And the Hood ones are quite special. And they do want them at the Webster Cottage. They do want them to be available for you to see because otherwise, you're right, Tim, they're locked up. So they would rather have people be able to go and see them in a real little house and enjoy them. And then I didn't mention that we are having, once again, our second year, we're having fourth graders come to Webster Cottage and tour it and study the artifacts. And we're very happy about this. We got another grant from Dorothy Byrne, good old Dorothy Byrne. And we have our consultants who are bringing the kids. The kids will walk from the Ray School. That's kind of a walk to Webster Cottage. And then they will study the antiques. They'll choose an object that they like and probably draw it and then go back and study it again and get the historical context. Last time we did this, you won't believe what they were interested in. The Civil War sword and the musket, of course. And then occasionally some of the china. Some of them were interested in, but it was kind of fun to work with the fourth graders and we're having them come back again. Yeah, Barbara.
I was just thinking, not being part of the board or anything, I have a job for you. And I was just going to suggest that it would be fun to have a tea for students.
You mean like Alice did?
Yeah.
No, you're absolutely right. It would be nice to have something because whenever I've been a docent at the cottage, we usually have about, I'd say 2 students come by. I don't know, I have to talk to all of you, Alan, you too. Whenever I run the cottage from 2:30 to 4:30, and I'm looking at Susan too, I usually have a couple of students, but I'm not having tea with them, but I'm talking to them and so on. But you're saying maybe we should have a tea, try a tea?
Might draw more people in to see the students.
And they could come together.
Yeah.
Instead of, we sort of get them one by one or by twos. We don't really, but we do have a lot of students. And I think it's very rare that a historical society in a town is on property at a college. Because we do get students, whereas most historical societies are in, down on Main Street, far away from any college. And they don't get the students. We're very fortunate the students do come in. Sometimes they'll say, I always wanted to go in this place, but it's never open. Oh, now it's open, I'm coming in, kind of thing. So we are fortunate that we do have students. And I know Alan's educated a lot of them, haven't you?
Yeah, and sometimes it's just, they kind of drop by, on an impulse. They said they've walked past that for, 3 or 4 years and they decided to, check it out.
That's right.
And it would be good if, the word would spread among more students,
Right.
They're-
I think it's something to work on, to have the tea. So anyhow, of course, all you ladies have to have the tea, right? Oh, excuse me, maybe we can have gentlemen too. Work on the tea, right? We could do it.
And they could serve the ladies.
Yeah, right. But anyhow, thank you for coming and thank you for celebrating Women's History Month.